Tonight, you'll slip into the role of a 5-star chef, someone who once ruled over a gleaming kitchen. Japanese knives sharp as whispers, trays of fresh seafood still glistening from the market, and prime cuts of meat marbled like jewels. Your life was tied to Michelin stars, to applause echoing through banquet halls, to the glitter of fine dining under golden lights. But fate, with its mischievous sense of humor, only needs a blink, a single breath. You sway, the world spins, and when your eyes open, everything has changed. No more polished steel, no buttery aroma melting into the air. Before you lies a smoke-choked kitchen, pots warped and dented, knives heavy with rust, and slabs of meat hung too long, dripping with a sour tang that mingles with the acrid sting of ash. The air is thick, so thick that one breath feels like swallowing a spoonful of coal dust. In that instant, the truth lands like a cleaver. You are no longer in your century. You've stumbled into the Middle Ages, a world where food isn't celebrated, nor savored, but simply survived. And the first thought bubbling up, half comic, half desperate, is good grief. Why is the food here so awful? And so your journey begins, a journey that feels at once like a farce stretched too long and a nightmare with no exit. Here, every meal is a bizarre performance. Every dish a secret best left untasted. And you, the stranger of haute cuisine, are now the unwilling star of a darkly comic saga titled, "Why Was Medieval Food So Terrible?" You open your eyes, and gone is the gleaming 5-star kitchen you once knew. No stainless steel sparkling under soft lights. No gentle trace of butter melting in the air. Instead, you're swallowed whole by a haze of smoke so thick it stings your eyes, as if someone just dumped a whole jar of chili powder into the atmosphere. Welcome to the medieval kitchen, a kind of escape room no one in their right mind ever signed up for. The fire crackles and pops in the open hearth at the center of the room, sounding less like cooking and more like a prehistoric industrial oven on overdrive. The smoke weaves into your hair, seeps into your skin, clings like some signature fragrance you never asked for. The reviewer inside you can't help but blurt, "This isn't Michelin. It's the backstage set of a low-budget horror film, heavy on the smoke machine." You glance around. Pots are dented beyond recognition, wooden spoons charred black, and the knife so rusted that slicing vegetables feels more like open-heart surgery than cooking prep. Every tool looks like a forgotten stage prop from a village play. Even the heavy wooden table in the center sags to one side, as if it's whispering. Do I collapse before or after dinner? From outside, chaos seeps in shouts, bleating livestock, the frantic flapping of chickens losing their patience and probably their lives. The air is damp, thick with a stew of wood ash, old grease, and the lingering funk of meat hung a little too long. You ask yourself, is this a kitchen or a storage unit for traumatic aromas? You try to take a deep breath, hoping to adapt. But instead of clean oxygen, your lungs fill with smoky density, and you feel the choke of every inhale. You think back to your hotel kitchen, where the exhaust fans hummed softly, like spa music in the background. Here, every breath is a survival challenge, one you didn't exactly audition for. But the smoke isn't just choking you. It's twisting the whole room into mirages, shadows of people flicker like ghosts. Objects ripple as if they're melting into the haze. You can't help but think, if Steven Spielberg ever needed an opening shot for the apocalypse, he might have sketched it here in this very kitchen. The smell is worse than the sight. Ash mingles with the stench of half-burned onions and the sour reek of cabbage someone forgot to toss out. Together, they form a symphony of stinks that no air freshener in the world could ever redeem. You, who once measured each grain of salt like a jeweler weighing diamonds, now stand in a place where the main seasoning is filth and smoke. Tiny specks of soot cling to your skin, coating you as if the kitchen itself is marinating you for tomorrow's menu. You imagine future diners walking in, spotting the smokehouse chef covered in ash, and thinking it's some bold new take on fusion cuisine. Your hand brushes the wooden table. Its rough grain scratches your palm raw, reminding you, in no uncertain terms, you're no longer in your world. And then the thought lands with bitter weight. If the kitchen is the heart of a home, then this heart has already been smoked into charcoal. You stand there, eyes burning, chest pounding, as if you've just jolted out of a nightmare. And as your gaze adjusts to the dim, choking haze of this medieval kitchen, you realize something more terrifying than the stench itself. Your profession, the craft that once drew applause and Michelin stars here, has been downgraded into farce. That gleaming knife you once used to slice sashimi into sheets of silk, forget it. Here, the so-called knife is nothing more than a jagged hunk of iron, better suited for chasing bandits than trimming a cut of meat. Silver forks and fine spoons gone. What you've got now is a cracked wooden ladle that looks one good stir away from collapsing into the stew as an accidental garnish. You glance around the kitchen and can't help but scream, inside Hell's Kitchen, no. This is Hell's Kitchen Medieval Edition. And you, once the star chef under chandeliers and soft piano music, have been downgraded to a hapless contestant. The challenge: cook a meal with rust-bitten tools, wilted produce, and a backdrop so grim Gordon Ramsay himself would just walk out. You remember your Japanese knives, sharp enough to glide through a tomato without bruising the skin. Compared to that, this blade feels like performing open-heart surgery with a shovel. When you try to cut a turnip, your hand trembles as if playing Jenga. Will the knife snap first? Or will the vegetable crumble before you're done? And the cutting board, a moldy log, tilted and swollen, exhaling the earthy stench of damp rot like a pop quiz for your sense of smell. You swear that if a modern food safety inspector saw it, they'd faint on the spot, then wake up only to faint again. Outside, chickens shriek in terror, their cries mixing with the rasp of rusty metal on wood. Together, they form a bitter soundtrack for the moment you realize your hard-won culinary pedigree means nothing here. Nobody cares that you once plated foie gras to applause, or that your soufflé could rise like a miracle. All they want now is for you to hack through meat without snapping the blade, and boil a pot of porridge without smoking the entire village into asphyxiation. You feel like an actor shoved into the wrong script. Instead of showcasing your culinary skills, you're fumbling with a set of props that belong in a medieval thrift shop. The reviewer in you can't help but snicker. This isn't cooking. This is a survival reality show where the flies are the audience and the judges are aristocratic stomachs. As you're still fumbling with the battered knives, a commanding shout booms from outside. The air suddenly falls silent, and through the thick haze of smoke, a regal figure takes shape. That figure, none other than the king himself, the man who is about to hand you a challenge unlike anything your entire career has ever prepared you for. You're still wrestling with a chipped knife that looks like a teenager's crooked teeth when the atmosphere suddenly shifts. Heavy footsteps thunder outside the door, boots striking the stone floor with authority. Then, through the curling smoke that rises like stage curtains, an imposing figure steps into view. The king, the lead actor in tonight's unsettling performance. This isn't the fussy kind of diner you'd expect a Michelin inspector in a crisp suit, quietly jotting notes into a little book. No, This is a man crowned in gold, draped in heavy furs, his scent a bizarre blend of sweat and rusted iron, like some kind of limited edition cologne no sane perfumer would dare release. One furrow of his brow is enough to make you feel like a side character dragged on stage to be eliminated in front of the judges' panel. And the twist, he's not here to sniff around. He's here to command. You, a 5-star hotel chef, are ordered to prepare a feast for the royal court, not for VIP guests, not for honeymooners, but for medieval nobles who treat meals as political weapons, as displays of power, and sometimes as the perfect excuse to lop off the head of the poor soul who served a dish that didn't quite match the vibe. You go still, your heart dropping right down to your heels. This isn't a career test anymore. It's survival. If a soufflé falls back at the hotel, you lose a Michelin star. But if the roast burns here, you could lose your head. The critic in you sighs. This really is a new TV format, cook or die medieval edition. The king's eyes sweep over the crooked pots and pans, then land on you smoke-stained clothes, hair in a mess, a face smudged with soot. You don't know whether he sees a chef or a poor soul who wandered into the wrong century. Then his voice cuts the silence like a blade, a cold command. No room for refusal. The whole kitchen seems to freeze. You hear your heart thudding in your chest. And somewhere in the smoky air, a hollow question lingers. How will you survive this feast of power? You thought the biggest challenge would be the king's stare, that look that could slice your courage in two. But no, the real enemy waits in the corner of the kitchen, the basket of vegetables. You step closer, and what hits you first are turnips so soft they're sponge-like, like they've been through 10 rounds of dishwashing. Touch one, and it feels like squeezing a moldy pillow, and the smell, it throws you straight back to the week the hotel fridge lost power for 3 days. The cabbage looks like a survivor of a house fire, outer leaves charred black, inner leaves mushy and collapsing, releasing a smell that's half decaying plant, half supernatural mystery. The reviewer in you blurts out, "If this is a Caesar salad, then it must be from a parallel universe, one where Caesar didn't get assassinated, but killed himself over a bad lunch. Carrots, that's being generous. They're long, twisted, like a wizard's crooked staff. Their skin so rough, you're convinced if you threw one at a wall, the wall would chip before the carrot broke. The damp, earthy odor clings to them, a reminder that in this era, the concept of washed clean is more unattainable than a chilled glass of champagne. You imagine trying to make a simple roasted vegetable dish the easiest way to win the king's favor. But how? When the ingredients look like they've been exhumed from a produce graveyard. You strain to come up with a fine dining twist, but your brain only screams back, "Fine. This is pure rotten dining." From outside come the sounds of servants hauling wooden carts, livestock bleating each noise, a reminder there's no escape. You think back to hotel kitchen meetings, where colleagues debated which organic greens would look prettiest on the plate. Now, presentation has been reduced to one desperate question. How do you hide the fact the vegetables are spoiled? You lift a turnip with trembling hands and mutter under your breath, presenting tonight's signature appetizer, wilted turnip, served in survival style. Kitchen smoke blends with the sharp reek of the produce, leaving you half laughing, half on the verge of tears. You barely escaped the nightmare of wilted vegetables, thinking nothing could possibly get worse. But then, when you open that burlap sack in the corner of the kitchen, you realize you were very, very wrong. Grains, the lifeblood of the medieval diet, lie inside, looking less like food and more like the aftermath of a battlefield. The barley is mixed with sand and grit, each kernel rough, practically darting your teeth. You want to survive. First, survive chewing gravel. The oats are hard, twisted, some even sprouting tiny shoots, leaving you unsure if this is meant for cooking or for a high school biology lab. The reviewer in you smirks bitterly. A bowl of porridge. Here is basically a free subscription to your dentist comes with cracked teeth, bleeding gums, and jaw inflammation included. You scoop up a handful, and grains of sand trickle through your fingers with a gritty sound, like the soundtrack of impending disaster. The musty, earthy smell clings in your nose, reminding you of those documentaries about flooded grain silos. Except here, it's not history footage, it's dinner. Your mind flashes back to the hotel kitchen, where imported quinoa was weighed out to the gram, carefully soaked until soft, and simmered gently on a sleek electric stove. Now, you've got a battered copper pot, smoke from burning wood stinging your eyes, and a heap of grain so dusty it puffs up clouds the moment you breathe near it. You picture medieval peasants huddled over a thick porridge, gnawing on each bite as if they're stress testing their front teeth. And in a shadowy corner of the sack, you spot a few kernels riddled with tiny holes from weevils, as if even the bugs have decided to leave a review. Thanks. but we're full. You sigh, trying to figure out how to salvage this mess. Maybe if you grind the grains down, boil them until they're mush, and toss in a pinch of salt if you're lucky enough to find any. But as you glance back at the burlap sack, the hopeless truth sinks in, no matter what tricks you try. Pebble porridge is still going to be the house specialty of this era. Smoke snakes through the kitchen, the dim firelight flickering across your face, highlighting the cruel irony a chef once trusted with Wagyu steak, now brainstorming a recipe called stone stew with oats. You think nothing could surprise you anymore after that ordeal. But then you lift the lid off a clay jar in the corner. A sharp, sour stench slams into your nose, so aggressive you almost miss the smoke you were just complaining about. Congratulations, you've just stepped into the heaven, or, let's be honest, the hell of medieval dairy. The liquid inside barely qualifies as milk anymore. It's clotted, chunky, and reeks with such acidity, you're convinced a full chemistry set could be extracted from it. The reviewer in you mutters, "If you've ever had blue cheese, this is the buggy beta version, crashing constantly, never updated." You grab a piece of cheese from the table. The rind is mottled with green mold, the inside yellowed and sagging, soft like a bath sponge that's been passed down through 3 generations. When you break it open, the sound isn't a crisp snap. It's a wet, squishy squelch, like something straight out of a horror movie. And the smell, a disturbing duet between damp gym socks and a refrigerator that's been unplugged for a week. You wince, remembering the proud curls of Parmigiano Reggiano you used to shave over pasta back in your hotel kitchen. Here, sprinkling this cheese on noodles would just mean adding an extra layer of despair. In the Middle Ages, they called this nourishment, a vital source of life. But to you, it feels more like a spiritual trial, forcing yourself to believe the human body really can endure almost anything. And maybe that was the truth of it, with no refrigeration, no sanitation. Every dairy product became a gamble, a hand of cards where the eater could only hope not to draw food poisoning on the very first bite. You dip a finger in to taste, and instantly your tongue goes numb. A sharp sourness racing across the roof of your mouth. It's like sipping a cocktail spiked with vinegar. You cough, forcing out a dry laugh. Fine dining. No, this is fear dining. The kitchen smoke still swirls around you, mingling with the acrid tang of spoiled cheese, thickening the air until you long to fling a door open and breathe something, anything clean. But no, the next trial doesn't give you a moment's rest. Back in your hotel kitchen, you were used to Malden sea salt tucked neatly in its box. Pink Himalayan salt sitting in glass jars like tiny edible jewels. With a single reach, you could choose the perfect kind to lift a dish to brilliance. But here, in this medieval kitchen, salt isn't a seasoning. It's an illusion. You rummage through every corner and finally uncover a few clumped, damp crystals hiding in a tiny clay jar, looking more like a cursed treasure than an ingredient. When you touch them, your fingers pick up a strange, clammy residue, as if even the salt itself grew weary after its long journey across oceans. The reviewer in you whispers, "Plot twist, the real spice of Europe is despair." You remember the simple rule of a modern kitchen. Just a pinch of salt can make flavors bloom, sweeten what's dull, soften what's bitter. But here, without salt, porridge turns into paste, meat becomes a chewing contest, and the vegetables, well, let's be honest, they were already a tragedy. For medieval people, calling salt more precious than gold wasn't an exaggeration. It meant survival with salt. Meat could last through the winter. Without it, the whole village starved. You stare at that tiny jar and feel as if you're holding the fate of the entire court in your palm. Honestly, it's more stressful than opening a souffle. You picture the marketplace, the wealthy clutching their little pouches of salt like holy charms, while the poor scramble to lick a stray crystal off the dirt, eyes lighting up as if they'd just hit the lottery. A sarcastic thought sparks in your mind if game shows had existed back then. The final round would have been called Hold On to the Salt. You sigh, glancing around the smoke-filled kitchen, while one lone grain falls onto the table with a dry tick, a reminder that this is your entire spice budget. And you realize, with this meager stash, your meals can only swing between two flavors, bland and despair. But before you can sink further into that thought, a servant rushes in with new orders. The king demands pepper. Not the end of your life kind of pepper, black pepper. The spice worth more than gold. The one you may never even glimpse in your entire lifetime. The moment you hear the words, black pepper, your heart skips. To you, a modern chef pepper is as ordinary as breathing. A quick twist of the grinder, a light dusting over a steak, and suddenly the whole room warms with its sharp aroma. But here, in a medieval kitchen, pepper is less of a seasoning and more of a Hollywood celebrity. Everyone's heard the name. But actually, seeing it feels rarer than a miracle. They whisper that pepper comes from faraway India, crossing oceans and storms, smuggled through perilous trade routes before it ever touches European soil. Each little bead of spice has had more adventures than a night in a ballad. And when it finally arrives, it doesn't land in your smoke-stained hands. It's tucked away in a silver box, displayed on a noble's table like jewelry. You can almost picture it, some lord seated at a feast, casually pinching a few black grains to sprinkle over his meat, tossing them like diamonds over a cake. Meanwhile, peasants outside will never see one in their entire lifetime unless they step on it by accident in a dream. The reviewer inside you smirks. Talk about peak social inequality. Some season their food with gold, while others season theirs with resignation. Your eyes wander to the spice jar in this kitchen, of course. It's empty. Not a single grain of pepper to rescue the bland porridge or lifeless slab of meat. You can't help but remember those gleaming stainless steel grinders back at the hotel, where just a few twists could fill the whole room with pepper's warmth. Now, that memory feels like a luxury you can no longer afford. Pepper, you realize, isn't just a spice here, it's a symbol of power. It was so precious, it once served as dowry, as currency, even as collateral. And you think, if I had pepper in this era, forget being a chef. I'd just set up a pepper stand and retire rich. But the harsh truth sits right in front of you, meals stripped bare, smoke-stained and burnt, no pepper, no flavor. And you finally grasp it. The banquet you've been ordered to cook isn't just about feeding power. It's about surviving in a world where even the simplest seasoning is out of reach. A servant's voice cuts through the haze, urging you to prepare the meat for the feast. You barely have time to swallow your frustration before the stench of those hanging slabs hits you sharp, gamey, soaked with smoke. No refrigeration, no real preservation, just a few desperate handfuls of salt and the heavy curtain of smoke filling the room. You haven't even shaken off the disappointment of having no pepper when the next challenge hits you heavier, ranker, and far more menacing the meat. In the corner of the kitchen, slabs of wild game dangle from hooks, coated in dust and smoke. From a distance, they look less like food and more like leftover props from a low-budget horror film. As you step closer, the stench rolls over you pungent, sour, animalistic, flooding your nose until your stomach clenches as if it's trying to escape. No fridge, no ice, no modern preservation. Just a pinch of salt, rarer than gold, and the blanket of smoke choking the rafters. In other words, the base seasoning for every meat dish here is rot. The reviewer in you lets out a bitter laugh. Medieval cuisine where the main course is marinated in resignation. Your eyes trace the fat, once golden, now turned a sickly gray-brown, like some surrealist painting no one would ever want on their wall. The flesh is shriveled, the outer edges hard as stone, while the center still weeps with a sticky, damp sheen. One phrase lodges in your mind a plot twist for the stomach. You lift the same chipped knife from before and try to cut through. It's less slicing meat and more hacking at a rotten log. Each strike lands with a dull thunk, jolting up your arm, leaving your hand buzzing as if you've just played lumberjack barehanded. You can't help but think of Wagyu steak, those silky slices that melt on your tongue like a love song. Compared to this, you almost want to cry. If Wagyu is a symphony, then this slab is a brass band rehearsing all the wrong notes. And through the haze of smoke, you picture the nobles waiting. They'll sink their teeth into the meat, chew slowly, and pretend the stench is really just the taste of the wild. Meanwhile, you, the poor chef, will be judged by every raised eyebrow. In that moment, you realize this meal isn't about pleasure. It's about survival. The meat isn't an ingredient. It's a trial. And you, a 5-star chef, must turn it into a dish, no matter how violently it defies reason. But before your nose recovers from the torment of spoiled venison, another assault arrives fish. A damp wooden barrel is cracked open, and the stench surges out so sharply it feels like you could slice it and plate it as an appetizer. Long river fish lie sprawled before you, slick and slimy. Their bulging, cloudy eyes looking like they've just returned from a haunted carnival. Their dull scales are caked with mud, some still draped in strands of riverweed, as if they chose to die inside a public dishwashing basin. The reviewer in you mutters bitterly, "Tonight's special parasite." Limited edition. You lift one up, and the body folds limply in your hand, soft and floppy, like an overused rubber band. Slime drips down your fingers, cold and pungent, leaving a sting of river rot that makes you feel as if someone dunked you straight into polluted water. You shiver, silently wishing for the gleam of stainless steel kitchen gloves, instead of your bare hand gripping this slippery nightmare. Your mind flashes back to the hotel kitchen, where salmon fillets glowed pink on beds of crushed ice, accented with lemon and sprigs of dill. Here, medieval fish are preserved by the generous hand of time and mud. The result is a reek so raw and earthy, it feels like an invitation to a brand new destination, taste bud hell. Knocks at the door signal that the feast is drawing near. You glance at the fish, already picturing nobles tearing into them, chasing down the stench with gulps of watery ale. They'll nod, pretend to enjoy, and then drift into chatter about wars and land while their stomachs wage a silent rebellion. You barely shake off the shock of rotten meat and fish before the king waves his hand, signaling the feast is to begin. And there it is before you. A swan, once white and elegant, the very emblem of a calm lake, now dragged onto the table as proof of a cruel maxim, beautiful to look at, not to eat. Its feathers have been plucked in a hurry, a few wisps still stubbornly stuck, looking more like a torn pillow dumped in the kitchen than a proud bird. You let out a tired breath. In a 5-star hotel, a swan might be a showpiece folded into napkins. Here, it's the main course, and a ruthless joke. The smell of singed skin rises as the swan is skewered and turned over the fire. Fat spits and hisses into the embers, sounds that should make mouths water, but here they feel more like the soundtrack to a failed experiment. The critic in you shrugs. This isn't Peking duck. It's a buggy beta roast. No one's patched. You watch the swan's flesh tighten, browning in blotches, each strand of muscle hardening like rubber. Imagine taking a bite. You know your jaw would have to file for extended leave. The flavor, you don't dare guess. Just by looking, you already know this will never appear on a fine dining menu unless it's the menu for a horror movie. And yet, to the nobles, roast swan is the ultimate spectacle. Flavor doesn't matter, only the appearance does. The bird is carried whole to the table, stray feathers painted over, peacock plumes stuck in as decoration, transformed into a kind of animal cosplay. The guests laugh, clap, their eyes shining at the grandeur of the feast. Never mind that the meat they're about to bite into could double as bowstring. You stand in the haze of smoke and fire, watching, more certain than ever, this isn't food, it's theater. Meals here aren't meant to nourish, but to flaunt wealth and power. And you, the chef, who once poured soul into every dish have been reduced to a background extra in this gaudy play. You don't even have time to dwell on the thought before the servants arrive with another tray, a dripping meat pie. Next up for the table. If roast swan was chewing rubber, this pie is swallowing a whole skillet of grease. The swan hasn't even finished receiving its hollow praise when a massive pie is set down. On its wooden tray, the crust gleams with oily gold under the firelight, looking less like pastry and more like a solidified crater of lard. You take a breath, but instead of that familiar, buttery richness, what hits you is the heavy stench of animal fat, like someone swapped out every block of French butter for an entire pig. The critic in you chuckles darkly. This isn't a delicate French millefeuille. This is a dairy spin-off gone wrong, a side dish that swallows your whole stomach. The crust is thick and heavy, hard as brick. Every time the knife strikes, it gives off a sharp clack, making you feel less like you're cutting pastry and more like you're stress testing building materials. Inside, the filling is a greasy mash of minced fat and meat, looking exactly like something someone hurriedly stirred together and tossed into the oven. You can't help but remember the dessert station back at the hotel Airy Millefeuille, golden lemon tarts, soft cream puffs. There, a slice of cake was joy. Here, a slice of pie is a dare. One bite and the fat bursts out, coating your mouth like glossy paint, leaving every sense of yours begging for relief. And yet, for medieval nobles, this is the peak of abundance. Fat is the luxury item, the more of it, the richer the feast appears. You watch them laugh, wipe grease on the tablecloth, and reach greedily for more. And you can only mutter inwardly, who needs hair conditioner when you've got multi-purpose pie grease? The smoke and the smell of fat cling together, thickening the air until it feels hard to breathe. And just as you're still reeling, another servant steps in carrying a tray dusted with strange powders, dishes painted in colors drawn not from herbs or fruit, but from crushed minerals and resin. You freeze, realizing what's coming next will be stranger still. You barely have time to swallow your nausea from the pie before the new dishes hit the table. This time, it's color. Too much color. The plates in front of you look like an artist's palette gone rogue. Blazing red, green, yellow, purple, like a carnival had landed on the dining table. At first glance, you might mistake it for artful plating. But when your finger brushes the bright red coating, a draught of gritty texture spreads across your skin. That's when you realize This isn't beetroot. It isn't turmeric. It's ground minerals. The kind of stuff we'd use today to paint walls. Not season food. The acrid smell rising from that cake makes you think less of food and more of a construction site. If anyone actually bit into it, they'd probably feel like they'd just signed up for a tasting menu called Concrete the Special Edition. A thought flashes through your mind if this dish ever appeared on a modern restaurant menu. The fine print would absolutely read, "Management is not responsible for customer health." But nobles see it differently. They glance at a plate of meat dusted in green powder, laugh with delight, and exchange proud looks. Here, color isn't about flavor, it's about showing off. The more garish the palate, the more extravagant the feast. It's like displaying a collection of jewels, except the jewels are ground up and sprinkled straight into your mouth. You can't help but laugh bitterly. Back in your hotel kitchen, color came from nature, the fresh green of basil, the golden hue of turmeric, the rich red of ripe tomatoes. Here, it comes from tar, metal powder, things a modern doctor wouldn't even let near a pantry. It's food that's literally to die for. Watching the banquet glitter under firelight, you feel less like you're witnessing dinner and more like you've stumbled into some twisted art exhibition. And that's when a shiver runs through you. If the nobility can paint death into spectacle, then the peasants, outside, gaunt and hollow, are left with nothing but thin gruel to survive. The moment you step away from the noble's gaudy colors, you're pulled into another world entirely, a place where peasants huddle around bowls of porridge so thin that even the wind passing over could ripple its surface. In front of you, a pot of grayish mush bubbles weakly over fading coals. It's so watery that the grains float adrift like lost travelers in a filthy sea. The smell of smoke, damp mold, and old iron clings to the air, turning this poor kitchen into a kind of symphony, composed entirely for the misfortune of your nose. You scoop up a spoonful of porridge, and it dribbles back down like a bad movie trailer, dragging on forever without offering any real substance. You smirk to yourself. If anyone calls this comfort food, it's probably because they just survived a war, not because they're savoring flavor. Children sit in a circle, wide-eyed, tiny hands trembling as they wait for a spoonful that holds less weight than the breeze, but more than hope itself. The adults gulp it down quickly, not for pleasure, but for survival. And in that moment, you fall silent. At the noble's feast, food is theater. Here, It's simply a fragile lifeline. Your mind drifts back to the five-star hotel, a pot of broth simmered all day, fresh vegetables, a stock so clear that one inhale warmed your heart. But here, the porridge has no scent, no taste, just presence. You eat to keep standing, drink so you don't collapse. An old man gives a faint smile, lips sinking into deep lines etched by time. He extends his bowl as if inviting you to share. And suddenly, your throat tightens. This isn't about flavor anymore. It's about kindness. While nobles flaunt food as wealth, peasants use it to preserve what little humanity they can. You sip. Blandness spreads across your tongue, yet beneath it lingers smoke from the hearth, the echo of endurance itself. And you realize this porridge could never score on any culinary chart, but it strikes straight at something modern. Diners often forget the raw value of survival. A hard clunk breaks the silence as a loaf of black bread lands on the table, heavy as a brick. It looks less like nourishment and more like a makeshift weapon. You glance at it and can't help but think, if a battle broke out right now, peasants wouldn't need swords or spears. Just hand out a loaf of this bread to each person, and the fortress would be safe. You pick it up. The surface is rough, gritty, gray-black, like ashes from a fire. A sharp sourness hits your nose, reminding you of dough left too long to ferment in some forgotten corner. You try breaking it apart, straining with both hands, and instead of a crisp crack, what you hear is more like rubble collapsing. Inside, it's dense, heavy, like holding a brick that decided to moonlight as food. Your mind flickers to modern sourdough soft slices, gently tangy, fragrant with wheat, paired with butter to make a chic breakfast. But here, medieval black bread isn't about delicacy. It's a nightmare for teeth and stomach alike. One bite feels like a jaw workout. Swallowing it. Sure, as long as you've already signed a waiver with your dentist. The peasants around you tear off small pieces, dipping them into the watery porridge. It's the only way to soften this so-called edible stone. And you realize, for them, black bread isn't for enjoyment. It's a block of fuel dense enough to keep hunger at bay a little longer. You sigh, a pang of sadness rising in your chest. In the hotel kitchen, bread was a gentle prelude for diners. Light crunch, warm aroma, a side of soft butter. Here, it's a trial by fire, forcing people to chew down the harshness of survival. Just as that thought lingers. A small wooden cask is rolled out. The sharp, yeasty smell fills the hut, overpowering the sour bread and thin porridge. Villagers pass around a frothy, flat, liquid, weak beer, the drink that stands in for water. After the thin porridge and the brick-heavy bread, you think there can't possibly be anything else to add. But then, a rough wooden cask is rolled out. The lid cracks open, foam bubbling at the rim. Not clear spring water, not nobleman's wine, but weak beer the drink peasants here treat as daily lifeblood. You lift a wooden cup, bring it to your nose. The smell of yeast hits half musty, half sour, like some strange mashup of spoiled rice wine and cloudy rice water left too long on the porch. You take a sip. The flavor washes over your mouth, flat and thin. The fizz teasing for a moment before fading into an aftertaste. Something between watered-down grains and regret. You smirk to yourself. So this is the medieval version of a soft drink, except softer than plain water. And yet, strangely, everyone drinks it with ease. Children take tiny sips. Adults pass the bowl around, their eyes softening as if comfort had been found in this faint brew. You realize it isn't about taste, it's about safety. River water, well water, crawling with sickness, but beer, even weak, carried less risk of a village falling ill. This isn't just a drink, it's survival in a cup. Your mind flashes back to the craft beers of your hotel kitchen. Amber gold, thick white foam, the bright perfume of hops filling the air. Compared to that, this medieval beer feels like it belongs to another universe entirely. But in its thinness lies the truth in the dim, hungry lives of peasants. Weak beer is a flicker of light, small, but steady, like a lamp flame fighting through the wind. You tilt your head back, sip again. That faint tingle on your tongue pulling you into the present moment. The smoky kitchen, the weak firelight, the watery porridge, the sour bread, and now this weak beer. Together, they weave a long ballad of scarcity. You're still lost in thought about that bowl of weak beer, thin as rainwater, when a new scene unfolds the corner of a country market, where food isn't just for filling bellies, but is also believed to be medicine. People crowd around, buying onions, garlic, and dried seeds with faces as serious as if they were trading gold. You pick up an onion. Its papery skin flakes off, and the sharp sting hits your nose. bringing tears to your eyes on the spot. A farmer tells you, eat raw onion. It drives away sickness, drives away evil. You can't help thinking, if modern life has doctors, then here, the doctor is one very spicy meal. Garlic doesn't fall behind. The dry, pungent cloves are treated like talismans. Folks tuck them into pockets, hang them over doors, even chew them raw like disinfectant-flavored gum. You picture an entire family chomping garlic together, the smell flooding the house until even ghosts would give up and leave. And then there are all kinds of little seeds, dill, parsley, anise, not sprinkled for flavor, but prescribed for the heart, the stomach, or to ward off evil spirits. Each tiny seed is handed the weight of magical powers, like some medieval version of a health supplement commercial. You think back to the hotel kitchen, where spices existed to wake up the palate, to elevate a dish. But here, the same onion, the same garlic, carry a different purpose: medicine, charm, faith. And you feel a mix of curiosity and sorrow. Before science could arrive, people placed their hope in their stomachs and in their sense of smell. You take a bite of raw onion. Tears stream down your face as the sting shoots straight to your brain. The villagers nod approvingly, convinced you're detoxing successfully. Meanwhile, you're coughing and wheezing, thinking to yourself, this isn't detox, it's flavor torture. Medieval edition. You thought onions and garlic were already the peak of healing cuisine. But no, the Middle Ages had an even stranger belief, one that makes you laugh and shiver at the same time you become what you eat. A farmer proudly points to a shriveled bear's head hanging in the corner of the kitchen and declares, "Eat bear meat, and you'll be strong as a bear." You eye the massive bone, smell the rank odor rising from it, and think, more likely, you'll just be strong in bacteria. But they believe it with all their hearts, enough to trade away their savings for a dried scrap of meat, hoping to wake up as warriors after dinner. And it doesn't stop at bears. The idea stretches to every creature. Eat a lion's heart to gain courage. Drink snake's blood to become supple. Chew horse hooves to grow unbreakable. You can't help but whisper to yourself, so what? Eat a whale, and suddenly you're swimming across oceans. Yet to them, this wasn't comedy. It was hope. You think back to the hotel kitchen, where diners sought a dance of flavors, rich, balanced with tangy, sweet with subtlety. Here, though, meals weren't just for eating. They were performances, transformations. Every bite a chance to become beast, warrior, or immortal, if only in the imagination. You look at their gaunt faces, their eyes lighting up whenever they speak of strength from food. They have no medicine, no doctors, only this innocent belief to fight off sickness and fear. And suddenly, you get it as irrational as it is. That belief is their only real medicine. You try chewing on a strip of dried meat, tough as old leather, refusing to break no matter how long you bite. The villagers pat your shoulder and smile. Now you have the strength of a bear. You force a laugh, thinking, if that strength means jaw pain, then yes, I believe it. A trumpet blares in the distance. The royal feast is ready, and like it or not, you're about to step into the grand finale, cooking in front of kings and nobles, armed with nothing but the same miserable ingredients and bizarre beliefs that nearly broke you already. The air feels heavy, as if you're walking onto the stage of a reality show finale, except here, the prize isn't money, it's keeping your head attached. Each step echoes hard against the stone floor, like the ticking of a countdown clock, pushing you to prove your worth. A servant shoves a basket into your hands. Rancid meat, wilted vegetables, slimy fish, and a pinch of salt so tiny it feels like mockery. You swallow hard. Back at the hotel, when a picky guest showed up, at least you had some say in the ingredients. Here, you have no choice, only the gnawing fear that if your dish fails, the court will remember you as the guest star chef who never made it past episode 1. And the pressure isn't just from the king sitting at the head of the table. Dozens of noble eyes stare from either side, chuckling, whispering, waiting for you to turn garbage into magic. But deep down, you know the truth with these ingredients. The only miracle you can hope for is that their stomachs are strong enough to survive the night. You take a deep breath, smoke filling your lungs, and force yourself to move. Every skill you ever learned suddenly feels like a luxury. This isn't about cooking well anymore. It's about cooking to survive. Your hand grips the jagged knife, the cold steel biting into your skin, and a bitter thought slips through fine, dining no. This is dead or dining. The entire room hangs in tense silence. The king taps his finger on the armrest, his gaze drilling into you, a reminder that every twitch, every movement is under scrutiny. Your back is slick with cold sweat, your shirt damp But your hands have no choice but to keep working. You slice, stir, and cook under the relentless eyes of the court. Spread before you wilted greens, rancid meat, reeking fish, and a pinch of salt so pitiful it feels like mockery. You rake through every recipe you've ever studied, but none of them ever taught you how to turn a disaster pot into a delicacy. You try simmering the vegetables, hoping the sweetness will rise and drown out the smoke. The result? They collapse into a watery sludge, the burnt smell still winning, and the pot bubbles over like some stage trick gone wrong. You glance around, screaming inside. This is a kitchen, not a pyrotechnics lab. You pivot to the meat. Thin slices, grilled over the coals, aiming for a crisp crust. But every cut shrivels into dry leather, so tough the knife bounces back instead of cutting through. The smell rising is less savory and more singed animal hide, enough to make nobles wrinkle their noses before the platter even arrives. You turn desperately to the fish, praying a soup will save you. But the broth clouds over, a muddy stench rising strong, as if the river itself had RSVP'd to the feast. Salt. You sprinkle the last precious grains, but they dissolve into nothing, powerless against the tidal wave of rot. One noble wrinkles his nose, hiding a laugh behind his hand. Another leans over to whisper in his companion's ear, eyes glinting as if this were a comedy show rather than dinner. You feel less like a chef and more like the punchline in a grim farce. The king sits still, fingers tapping steadily against the armrest, his face unreadable. But it's that very silence that weighs heavier than any curse or insult. You know each small failure is piling up, ready to detonate into disaster at any moment. You wipe the sweat from your brow, force a smile, and whisper to yourself, "It's fine." Failure is the mother of success. Then another voice inside your head adds bitterly, and maybe also the mother of death at this feast. Just as despair begins to sink its claws in, an idea sparks if you can't win by their rules. Why not bend them to yours? A little modern flair, a whisper of fine dining in this medieval inferno. Maybe that's your only way out. You draw in a long breath. In your mind, you hear the steady, comforting voice of your modern training. If you're stuck in the past, at least carry a taste of the present with you. And so, you gamble everything trying to turn this wreckage of ingredients into something resembling fine dining, right here in the royal hall. First, you slice the wilted greens into paper-thin strips, layering them delicately. Not salad, no, but in your mind. You christen it carpaccio of decay. The flavors know better, but at least the presentation makes it look less like compost. As for the rancid meat, you give it a quick sear over the fire, then trim it into tiny bite-sized pieces, arranging them in a circle across the plate, sprinkling the last few grains of salt in the center like precious jewels. A bitter smile tugs at you. If I can't save their taste buds, maybe I can at least fool their eyes. And then there's the fish. You gamble filleting it. If that word isn't too insulting to the rusted blade, dipping it quickly in boiling water to chase away the swampy stench. Then topping it with a ladle of thin porridge broth. You whisper to yourself, fusion dish, fish in a pond of porridge. Even the name feels like a con to fool an unsuspecting audience. You place the 3 dishes on the table, adjusting edges, tucking a few wilted leaves in for garnish. The hall stirs. Medieval nobles, used to platters piled high, now find themselves staring at plates with negative space, with aesthetic. A few lean forward, eyes glinting as if they've just witnessed sorcery. The king raises an eyebrow. He studies the tiny plate as though debating whether it's food or a puzzle piece from some forgotten toy. Silence spreads, thick enough to hear your own heartbeat thumping against your ribs. You know what comes next will decide everything. This fine dining plate could either save you or mark you forever as the kitchen jester. When a crude wooden fork is brought forward, all you can do is pray. The fork stabs into the sliver of rancid meat you'd so carefully disguised as art. The hall holds its breath. These nobles, used to mountains of food, now find themselves confronting a dish so small, so neatly arranged. It borders on baffling. You watch every motion, sweat beading on your brow, pulse pounding in your ears. And then the twist. The first taster frowns, not because the meat tastes rotten, but because it's too tiny. A chuckle slips out from one corner of the table. Another noble tries a bite, then bursts into laughter. What kind of meat vanishes before you can even chew? Laughter ripples outward, spreading like dominoes across the long banquet hall. You freeze. You'd been bracing for grimaces over the stench. But no, their surprise isn't about the smell. It's about the portions. For you, this is the sacred, less is more of fine dining. For them, it's comedy hour at the banquet. But the surprises aren't done. That rustic fish dish you'd thrown together as an afterthought, just a flimsy fillet drowned in porridge, gets tasted by a noble. He pauses, then nods slowly. This feels familiar, like the meals I had as a child. The whole table leans in, curious, each eager to try. And strangely enough, while the meat and vegetables had flopped spectacularly, your fish in a pond of porridge strikes a chord. It isn't delicious, but it carries something deeper, the taste of home, of childhood, of hungry days they once endured. You stand frozen, equal parts stunned and bewildered. The dish you'd dismissed as a cover-up suddenly becomes the highlight of the feast. No tricks, no elegance, just raw, simple familiarity. Laughter bubbles, whispers ripple, and soon applause fills the hall. Not everyone is pleased, but clearly you've struck some odd nerve, a little humor from the tiny portions, a little nostalgia from the humble fish. In that moment, you realize surprise doesn't come from perfection. It comes when people see themselves in what's on the plate. The room swells with noise, snickers, murmurs, claps, mingling with groans of disapproval. You see it clearly. Now, your dish has ignited what feels like a medieval parliament session at the dinner table. Everyone has an opinion. No one agrees. A plump noble bursts out laughing, slapping his thigh. A meal this small. Surely the gods are mocking us. He scoops up another bite of the fish-in-porridge. Then, to everyone's shock, nods with misty eyes. It reminds me of long ago, back when I had no land. I ate exactly like this. The hall falls silent for a heartbeat, stunned. And then, almost instantly, it erupts into roaring laughter, because who could believe a man draped in jewels and gold had ever known hunger? On the other side of the hall, a younger noble scowls, slamming his spoon onto the table. This is an insult. I want a banquet overflowing with food, not these pathetic crumbs. Does this cook think we're children? His eyes burn with fury, as if you'd just ruined a fashion show instead of serving dinner. At the far end, a noblewoman lets out a delicate laugh, covering her mouth. How amusing. Never have I seen a dish cause such an argument at one table. Perhaps that's the true art. You can't tell whether to thank her or apologize. The noise rises. A marketplace disguised as a grand hall. Some nobles demand you be thrown out immediately. Others lean forward, curious to try more. And in the middle of the chaos, the king sits silent, unmoving, his gaze locked on the tiny plate before him. his finger tapping steadily against the armrest of his throne. That silence is heavier than all the laughter, sharper than all the shouting. You swallow hard, heart pounding. Every eye turns toward the throne. The true reaction, and perhaps your verdict, is about to be spoken. The hall falls into a hush as the king finally speaks without words. He does not laugh, nor frown. Slowly, he reaches out and pinches a small piece of your fish-in-porridge, the dish where you poured equal parts hope and despair. He chews slowly, very slowly, as if what he is weighing on his tongue isn't food, but your entire fate. You hold your breath, and then, instead of praise or anger, the king gives the slightest nod, not the triumphant nod of approval, not the dreadful nod of an execution order, just a vague dip of the head, half acceptance, half indifference. Like a stern judge letting a contestant slip past auditions, but with no chance of winning the trophy. Around you, the nobles begin to murmur again. Some snicker, some lean in for another bite, others sigh in disappointment. But for you, it's enough. Because in that fragile moment, you realize something no culinary school ever taught here. Food is not about refinement, nor about creativity. It's simply about survival, whether that survival comes in the form of thin porridge, bread as heavy as stone, or a bite of fish that stirs up childhood memories. The truth stands clear. Nobles eat to flaunt power. Peasants eat to stay alive. And you, a chef from another world, are caught between those two divides. Suddenly, understanding that taste isn't the only measure of a meal. Sometimes, flavor matters less than what it carries belief, memory, or just enough to keep a stomach full for one more day. You exhale, your shoulders finally easing from the weight. Amid the jumble of laughter and grumbling, you whisper to yourself, "I've changed." Cooking isn't only about making something delicious. It's about survival. And survival, sometimes, is the strangest dish of all. Yet, as the thought settles, another question rises, echoing in your mind like an unfinished chorus. So in the end, why was medieval food so bad? You sit there after the feast, your head still spinning from the unforgettable flavors, unforgettable in the most literal sense, because they've clung to your hair, your skin, your clothes. As the smoke and fire slowly fade, you start piecing together the real reason why was medieval food so downright awful. The first answer lies in the climate. Europe back then was bitterly cold, with long winters and painfully short summers. Vegetables couldn't stay fresh for long, often wilting within days. The cold wasn't enough to preserve meat, while the rare bursts of heat only made food spoil faster. Both peasants and nobles shared the same fate. Ingredients were never at their best, always teetering on the line between edible and dangerous. Then came the matter of preservation. No refrigerators, no freezers, no vacuum sealing. Everything relied on two crude methods, salt and smoke. Salt was as expensive as gold, something only a few could afford. Smoke, on the other hand, you've already experienced it. Kitchens, thick with haze, like scenes from a low-budget horror film, and dishes so drenched in char they masked the stench of decay, but never improved the taste. Rotting meat, swampy fish, wilted greens, cheese gone sharp and sour. All of it was the inevitable outcome of having no real way to preserve food. Medieval people ate what nature forced on them, not what they chose. You can't help but laugh, a little bitterly. In this age, the only Michelin stars belong to bacteria. You remember the gleam of the hotel fridge, fresh red cuts of meat on the top shelf, crisp greens stacked neatly below. Every drawer held at the perfect temperature, compared to clay jars, smoky rafters, and slabs of meat hanging in soot. The contrast feels like a canyon you could never cross. Looking back, you realize medieval food wasn't terrible because the cooks were bad. It was terrible because they were constantly at war with weather and time. And in that war, the winner was rarely human. It was mold. You've seen how harsh the climate and preservation methods were. But the picture of medieval dining isn't complete without another bitter truth social divide. Food, just like land and power, was split into two parallel worlds on one side. Nobles, flaunting excess. On the other, peasants scraping by. At the noble tables, you saw roasted swans, tough as leather, pies dripping with grease, dishes dyed with toxic minerals. Awful. Yes, but at least they were abundant, grand, and meant to impress. Outside those banquet halls, peasants had nothing but thin porridge, sour black bread, and beer so watery it was basically tinted water. Two pictures so starkly opposed that, if a food critic had existed back then, he might have written, "Medieval cuisine, one side eats to show off. The other eats just to breathe." The cause: trade was weak, transport slow and dangerous, and rare spices or prized ingredients were reserved for the upper class. Pepper had to cross seas from India, Salt traveled halfway across a continent. Both became symbols of power, not seasonings for everyday meals. The wealthy could sprinkle pepper on their meat as if scattering diamonds. The poor could live and die without ever laying eyes on a single grain. You remember the meager village market, wilted greens, grain mixed with pebbles, cheese speckled with mold. That wasn't choice. It was all they could afford. Food itself became a measure of class by looking at a meal. You knew instantly who held power and who was barely holding on. In your heart, a comparison stirs in a modern hotel. Every guest, from business travelers to tourists, gets food of the same quality. But here, dining mirrors the rigid class system. What you eat doesn't just decide your health. It defines your place in society. You let out a long sigh. Now, tracing back through every reason, you see it clearly. Medieval food wasn't terrible just because it spoiled, lacked salt, or was poorly preserved. It was terrible because it was the byproduct of inequality, of division, of a world where meals were living proof of human distance. You sit quietly in the kitchen, now cooling after the feast. The fire that once roared in the hearth is down to glowing embers, crackling now and then like the tired sighs of burnt wood. Smoke still lingers, thin and pale, more like a veil drawn over memory than the choking haze it was before. You stretch your hands toward the fading warmth, the heat soaking gently into your smoke-stained fingers. And in that moment, you realize all the sweat, the fear, the rancid smells and sour bites have softened into a strange stillness. This hearth, even with the acrid scent still clinging, is the heart of the home, the place where people gathered around thin porridge and heavy black bread to endure another endless winter night. Your eyes wander across the room, the rusted knife, the dented pot, the wilted greens, the reeking fish. None of it belongs in a 5-star restaurant. Yet together, they weave a story, the story of survival. And you can't help but smile. Wry and weary here, a kitchen doesn't need a Michelin star. It only needs to keep people alive. Outside, the night wind slips through the cracks, carrying the faint murmur of villagers sunk in their fragile sleep. You wonder, do they dream of a better meal? Or do they simply pray that come morning, their loved ones will still be there by the fire? You sit before the hearth, now faded, gray ash spread quiet and still, smoke thin as the final breath of a long day. In that silence, you hear your own whisper clearly. Yes, the food here is awful, but people still endure. You recall every moment wilted turnips, thin porridge, the heavy black bread, the roasted swan, tough as leather, the cheese sour as despair. Each dish was a trial, each feast an act of endurance. And yet, people ate. They survived. They laughed. They passed hope to one another. Meals weren't for pleasure, but for proof that they had not fallen. You sigh, but slowly. A smile spreads across your face, because somewhere between the smoke and the sourness, you've found a quiet truth. Food isn't always about flavor. Sometimes it's about resilience. And in that harshness lies a fragile beauty, the sharing of a dry crust, the glance of understanding over a thin pot of gruel, the laughter that slips out even in despair. If anyone were to ask you about this journey, you'd answer medieval food wasn't good, but it was honest enough to reveal the poverty, the hardship, and the stubborn strength of people. You close your eyes, letting the smoke and ash fade. Your heart softens, as though after the storm, the first light of dawn is rising. And in the dreams ahead, you know you won't recall the rancid meat, nor the sour cheese. What will remain is something gentler, the relief of knowing that in the dark, people still found a way to sit together, to share a meal, no matter how poor enough to keep life going. You've walked the whole journey from the moment you opened your eyes in that smoke-stained kitchen, through the glittering but hollow feast of nobles, and out to the countryside with its thin porridge, heavy black bread, and beer that tasted like plain water. You've faced rancid meat, muddy fish, sour cheese. You've tasted salt as precious as gouda and pepper, as rare as a miracle. Every step reeked of disappointment, yet shimmered faintly with glimpses of human endurance. Medieval food didn't offer delight. It offered survival. And yet, in that harshness, you saw something clearer. People who could laugh in poverty, share in hardship, and turn a thin bowl of porridge into a fragile thread of hope. Perhaps that was the true seasoning, not written in any cookbook, but carved deep into collective memory. Now, as the hearth has cooled and the ashes have settled, you can finally close your eyes. Let the whisper of the wind carry you away from that heavy-smelling kitchen, guiding you into a calmer sleep. In your dreams, you won't see wilted greens, rancid meat, or weak beer. Instead, you'll see a hand reaching out, a smile in the middle of hardship, and a small fire burning steadily. Because in the end, the message isn't in the taste, it's in the people, no matter how bad the food. They endured. And you, as you leave this medieval dream behind, carry with you that same quiet warmth, enough to let you drift off into deep, gentle rest, as if you too had found a small candle glowing in the dark.